An agent's duty to disclose material facts known to them is not limited to disclosures of the property's physical condition. A death on the property can become a material fact if the death affects the market value of the property, or the buyer indicates a death on the property will interfere with their use and enjoyment of it. Let's go over another example. Consider a buyer who enters into a purchase agreement negotiated by an agent acting as either the seller's agent or the buyer's agent. The buyer receives a transfer disclosure statement discussing the condition of the property and submits an offer. However, the buyer is unaware multiple murders occurred on the property more than 3 years before the buyer's purchase offer. The agent conceals their knowledge of the murders from the buyer. Further, the agent is aware that the notoriety of the murders adversely affects the market value of the property, placing its value below the price the buyer is agreeing to pay. The transaction closes, the buyer occupies the property. Later, the buyer learns of the murders. Upon discovery, the buyer sues the agent to collect their price-to-value money losses. The buyer claims the agent had a duty to disclose the deaths since the agent knew the property's market value, due to the stigma of the deaths, was measurably lower than the purchase price paid. The agent claims they do not have a duty to disclose the deaths since they occurred over 3 years ago and the deaths were not required to be disclosed on the TDS. Did the agent have an affirmative duty to disclose the deaths? Yes, the deaths had an adverse effect on the property's market value and were material facts that were intentionally concealed from the buyer. Thus, both the buyer's and seller's agent have an affirmative duty to disclose their prior deaths when the death might affect the buyer's valuation or desire to own the property. And, as before, when it comes to the degree of responsibility owed, the buyer's agent has a specific agency duty to represent the buyer, whereas the seller's agent has a general duty. Let's conclude this video with one last example. Consider a buyer's agent who is aware of a death occurred on the real estate within the 3 years of a buyer's purchase offer. There's that 3-year time period again. Now, in this instance, the value of the property is not adversely affected by the death. The buyer does not ask their agent if any deaths have occurred on the property and later purchases the property. After closing, the buyer learns of the death. The buyer becomes distraught and is deprived of the pleasurable use and enjoyment of the property. The buyer's severe attitude about death is a unique personal concern which was unknown to their agent. The buyer claims their agent breached their agency duty by failing to disclose the death since it inflicted an intangible harm and prevented them from enjoying the real estate. Should the buyer's agent have disclosed the existence of the death? Yes, the death occurred less than 3 years ago, so the buyer's agent was required to disclose. Further, and as a matter of prudent practice, the buyer's agent ought to determine if a known death might affect the buyer's decision to purchase the property, regardless of when the death occurred. Remember, a buyer's agent has a greater agency duty of care to protect the buyer than does the seller's agent. A buyer's agent is to disclose any death occurring on the property within 3 years, but they're also to disclose a death occurring greater than 3 years ago if they believe the death might affect the buyer's decision to make an offer. It's the buyer's agent's duty to investigate and disclose material facts about the property and the transaction. Thus, a greater burden is placed on the buyer's agent to know and understand their client. This is commonly known as the Know Your Client rule. Conversely, buyers owe a duty of care to themselves. Buyers are advised to inquire and discover facts readily available to them or their agent in an effort to protect their own personal interests. Generally, sellers' agents are not required to voluntarily disclose information to a potential buyer regarding a prior occupant whose death, from any cause, occurred on the real estate more than 3 years prior to the purchase offer. A seller's agent is also not required to disclose whether the prior occupant was afflicted with HIV or AIDS, as this is a protected class of people. However, keep in mind that if a death on the property for some reason adversely affects the market value of the property, then it is to be disclosed, regardless of when the death occurred. Similarly, on direct inquiry by the buyer or the buyer's agent about deaths on the property, the seller's agent is to disclose their knowledge of any deaths on the real estate, no matter when they occurred. An intentional concealment of a death after a buyer makes a direct inquiry is a breach of the seller's agent's general duty and the buyer's agent's agency duty. An inquiry by the buyer into the deaths on a property indicates a death on the premises is a material fact, which might affect the buyer's use and enjoyment of the property. This imposes an affirmative duty on the buyer's agent to investigate or recommend an investigation into any deaths before an offer is made.